Since we're now come to the point where we're going to sort of gather all the evaluators up on stage here, and for some questions, and also from me firstly, and then from you. And so the discussion is about what have we learned and where to go from here.
Hello.
Well, so you all have been external evaluators to these efforts in establishing centers of excellence at the Swedish universities. A 10-year program that emanated from the same research bill in 2004. So my first question then is, did you ever have any aha moment, or was there something that really surprised you when you performed this evaluation? Would you like to start, Jürgen?
Well, I can start. I was really surprised how much you can achieve with a small amount of resources. I mean, it's always nice to have more money, but I think the Linnaeus program really is a good example where if you have a long-term perspective, if you go for breakthrough activities where you have a flexible use of resources, only few regulations, lean administration, you can really do something. So I will recommend this to my German colleagues to think about, let's say, such a, how can I say, low threshold, high impact program. I was really surprised and I liked it.
Very good, thank you. And you, Marja, did you have any aha moment? You know about the Swedish system a little bit, perhaps.
Well, an aha moment perhaps was the very, very strong bottom-up philosophy. Of course, now I'm not talking about, researchers choosing their subjects and methods, but I'm more thinking of the management of the individual centers. They had very variable modes of leading the centers. Many have collegial leadership, rotating leadership. In the Finnish Center of Excellence program, there are much more rigid requirements of, having the leadership in place and one director and vice directors, etc. And the same concerns the universities. No sort of strategic guidance at large of the centers of excellence. So also sort of a bottom-up philosophy at the university leadership. And the amazement is that it works. So this appeared not to be a weakness, what concerns now the results of the entire program. I have another point, but maybe I will come back to that after the interventions of the others.
Well, I mean, I was sort of taken that you actually remembered to evaluate the program because so much has happened since 2006, and so you actually, in a way, poked or nudged, so to speak, both universities and participants to actually reconstruct what has happened over the years. So I think that's a very good thing. I mean, that we have this rather cornucopia of initiatives which characterize Swedish research policy, but you actually say that, well, one day we will be back, and one day we will actually look at what has happened, and we will have a stern, even a jury with the gold and silver and bronze medals and so forth. So I think that's a very, I mean, actually remind that these are sort of not gifts for free, but they actually come with conditions, and we ask you to remember to actually reconstruct what has happened. So I think that was a strong aha moment. And also that the conclusion was so, in your case, so encouraging. Do it, fail again, but fail better.
Better. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Anders.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, I'll take something of a more personal reflection, maybe. I am still quite academically young, and I haven't been working myself with centers of excellence or this sort of research environments before. In my dissertation, I worked with a very traditional and disciplinary research field, namely economics, which is very much focused on um, um, scientific excellence of a classic kind. So what's been striking working here is the very completely different way of doing research in these centers. Both the interdisciplinarity, of course, and the collaborative research, but also the way that, as I mentioned in the presentation, Vinnova has been working with this quite active management and evaluative processes. And for me, it's probably been an insight that research comes in many different forms, and there are different needs in the research landscape, and we need sort of different structures and funding instruments that sort of complement each other. It's a reflection.
And you then, John?
Well, I thought one of the things that, looking back at the Forte centers, I think one of the things that struck me, not so much at the beginning, I think, but as the centers developed, is the way that they began to, I think there was the idea at the beginning that they would be perhaps developing areas of research that would emphasize interdisciplinarity and perhaps bring in younger generations of scholars. The way different centers began to make sense of those objectives and actually take them rather seriously and do them. It didn't actually surprise me, perhaps in a way, because it was part of the original objectives. But the fact that they did succeed in doing that by and large, I thought was a quite pleasant outcome of the evaluation.
Well, it's been very positive outcomes out of this evaluation, all of them, I think, in that sense. And my next question then to you, when you have listened to the other evaluations, what have you learned from each other's presentations here today that either confirms or contradicts the findings from your own evaluations? Is there anything that springs to mind that you feel that has been really sort of, well, this was something I didn't know about, this type of initiative? I turn to you again, Jürgen,
Yeah,
because you come from sort of the central, or more central European perspective, and are very experienced in these larger programs and a very much larger country. Is there anything that you think that you, when you heard about the other initiatives as well?
Honestly, there was for me no surprise.
No.
Because at the end, if you look at the science system of a country, you have to have the right mixture. You need, some initiatives like the Linnaeus program based on excellence and groundbreaking research. We don't know, and so forth, what you said. Then you absolutely need research activities that serve in a strategic way national needs, also with the right research infrastructure. And then there is the aspect of wealth creation. I mean, the money that scientists spend has to be earned somehow. So you also need some research organizations that take care of this wealth creation aspect of research. So you need the right mixture, and the system as a whole has to work. I somehow experience Sweden as a country that is very consensual, where everybody is equal, everything is very transparent. Be courageous and make a difference. Not everything is equal, not all the universities are equal, and so forth. Maybe what is still missing in your program is an initiative where you give a large amount of money to the best researchers that you have in your country. Just let them do whatever they want to do at the individual level. And then, of course, you can create centers with all the aspects that we discussed. I think the right balance is important. And as a smaller country, of course, you have to make a very, how can I say, good use of the limited resources. But the right mixture is important. I had the feeling that you have a good mixture of different activities. Maybe there are some aspects, I wouldn't say missing, but my understanding is you are permanently benchmarking your system at the European and international level, and be critical, also self-critical.
Thank you.
So if I compare what I heard from the Forte evaluation, and I also read the report, so there are several very, very important, absolutely common points. So the findings are similar between these two programs, what concerns now research excellence and building of sustainable research environments, researchers' careers and the younger generation, and the internationalization of the Swedish researchers' base. So you identified weaknesses in the commitment of the host universities' financial commitments, and also, of course, as you said, with the post-program fate of the individual centers. So we had the same observations. What struck me in the Linnaeus evaluation was that there were very few mentionings in the documentation and in the hearings of collaboration with industry. Of course, the technical universities have these, that's clear, but nevertheless, the sort of highlights and also highlighting the importance and success in these. But now I start to understand, because there are other programs which focus on this particular societal relevance. So now maybe this point makes sense, that we didn't hear, I think, enough of that as we were expecting.
Well, I mean, and there are several striking things. I mean, from John's presentation, I learned or inferred that even in, I wouldn't say constrained, but I mean, in controlled sample of recipients, you can create lots of variation also within the pool of, let's say, Forte researchers. It's not just the same ducks that sort of swim around in the pond, but they swim a bit differently or in different groupings. So you can actually bring about variety also when you have I wouldn't say small, but smallish kind of sample of recipients. And from what I learned from the VR is that you can actually ask the research community to self-organize. You can actually throw out an opportunity, and you will get an intelligent response, which is rather, I mean, in the German case, I mean, you have the universities going, and you need plans and so forth and so on. And in Finland has a rather delimited sort of understanding what the center is. This is much more of a variety between different types, and it worked. And that, I think, was also striking. But it also indicates that this is tough money for the recipients. You need to have some sort of embeddedness of these groups. Otherwise, they will be, I wouldn't say that the shit hits the fan, but I mean, there will be effects that will lead to people focusing on other opportunities during the duration of the program. So you need mechanisms that sort of make the environments coherent over time. And here I think it's striking that the universities have some lessons to learn. I mean, how do you create coherence over time in these groups? And it's also interesting to see that a yes and a no equals a yes. Your first 2 points. You had first a yes and then a no, and that equaled yes. And I think that's also very interesting, that it's a promising initiative to actually do. And I also think that when you have some sort of duration over time, it works to have different programs in combination. So ideally, you should have programs that maybe have the self-organized nature of the Linnaeus environments, but also work in this more, I mean, with intense contacts with societal partners. So ideally, people should actually try to do several things at the same time. So they shouldn't exclusively be Linnaeus environments, but they should actually have two thoughts, keeping two thoughts at the same time.
Anders?
I would like to pick up on John's observation about the challenges of the ending of center funding and sort of where to go next. And I think it raises two questions, which are quite general for the Center of Excellence instrument. The first one is what do we want to achieve with this? I think it was one of the assessments of the competence centers where the funders thought that they expressed it very nicely like this: when the party is over, it's over. So this is a one-time grant. Now go out and play and sort of survive on your own. It's not supposed to be a continual grant. But that's, I think, a question of how we want to view the purpose of this. Do we want to create enduring structures that maybe can receive continued funding? That structures that provide continual and renewed high-quality outputs, or do we intend the grant to be a mechanism for renewal and sort of achieving novelty and upcoming research groups and so on? That's the first question. And the second one is the question about these initiatives as one-off initiatives, or should we have some sort of continuity and clarity about sort of repeated, I think you mentioned that initially as well. Should there be a sort of transparency in the research community that we have expectations, that we have calls every 3 or 5 years or something like that, so we know there will be upcoming calls and possibilities to continue these center constellations?
Could I just mention here that the Finnish Center of Excellence program started in '95, I believe, and it is continuing.
Yeah.
That is a continuing concept. That is a great value.
Could be tried here as well.
I mean, I think on that last set of issues, I think I think it will be difficult and not perhaps a good idea to have a very inflexible idea that you just have centers that continuously get funding even after the 10 years. So I'm not suggesting something like that. But I think there is an issue that came up a lot with the 10 centers we were looking at, about that you had this kind of funding decisions, you had some kind of interim discussion, but there wasn't really much discussion about what happens after. So in a way, I think it's more that point, but I do think in practice, and this also goes back to the point that was raised about the Linnaeus centers, that if you have like perhaps calls for funding for centers on a regular basis, then there would be the possibility that areas of research that are emerging, developing, could also be reflected in applications. And I think that is more the kind of model actually which we are used to in the kind of UK context. Although the UK might not exist much longer, we still just about exist. But in the UK system, we have more that model for the last 20 years or so. But I think that there's also the kind of disadvantage of that kind of thing, that you have these centers that then disappear rather quickly because they're funded for a period, and then a new fashion comes on, and then it's difficult for centers that still have a reason to exist to continue. So I think there is that kind of, I do agree in general with the idea that perhaps just having one call and then fixing everything for 10 years is not such a good idea. But then there's the issue of what happens if issues remain important. I think another issue which struck me as important, and in a way comes to both the other presentations, is this issue of societal importance. And in the UK, we use the language of impact a lot, which is the kind of language that has crept into the discussion in the UK. But I think societal impact was, in a way, part of the Forte centers, but a bit like you described, it came into the discussion a bit later than the beginning of the centers. So it became something we discussed more in the final evaluation and less in the interim evaluation and less at the beginning in some ways, although it was there. But I think it's likely in the future that issues about impact, societal impact, will be important for researchers to be able to at least engage in a dialogue, given changing political and other environments that we're all part of, not just in Sweden, but in the UK or in Germany or other contexts. You have this issue which is not always clear, but it's certainly in in another context which I've been involved with, which is the research excellence framework in the UK, issues about impact have become really crucial in the development of this model of research evaluation over the last 10 years. But I don't think anybody really knows what impact is. But it's supposed to be important, so we're supposed to be evaluating it. But in all honesty, I'm not sure people are that clear, even though governments, research councils, other bodies talk about it. I think from a social scientific perspective, it's always difficult to know what is it that we're really measuring. I mean, societal impact is a good term in a way. Impact is a more generic and loose term, but I think there is the issue, what are we measuring when we do that? And I think it's not going to go away, but it's something we need to perhaps think about.
In the Linnaeus evaluation, we call it actually societal relevance, since impact, it's really hard to decide when the impact is happening.
That might be a better term.
Yeah, to some extent. Thank you. And now, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Yes, over here. There, in the middle there you have.
So thank you. I'm Gunnar Landgren from KTH. So I would like your comments on the role of these programs and in the funding agencies for picking out the scientific, technical topics and the sort of push-pull interaction between the university managements and the funding agencies in actually being able to accomplish a prioritization and a focusing effect. For example, in the Linnaeus program, universities were allowed to send in a certain number of applications, which in most cases were quite much larger than the number they actually got in the end. So that enabled the university management to do a pre-selection where they thought they could possibly be strong, and then they got some additional money that helped them to actually be very strong, and that became part of the prioritization. And it certainly, I think you can say that in the KTH case, we got 3 Linnaeus centers that actually strengthened areas where we, of course, were very strong from the beginning, but we still are very strong. And I think that is sort of we could not have done that without the Linnaeus money. So I think, it wasn't possible to just say that this, by definition, is our strategic priority. We need this sort of interaction. And also, I think the funding agencies have some kind of responsibility to make sure that they put their bets on a good application. Of course, the sort of the writing, the art has to be good, but also that you identify emerging areas, make sure that we don't get all the centers in one area, and that there's some kind of there's maybe identify that there is maybe a lack of proposals in emerging areas where we need to take special measures. So if we could comment on this, I think that the topics are very important in this.
That's
maybe
for you.
I
for you.
No, I think that
I can start, and maybe you can.
That's good.
You can add. We really discussed this quite lengthily, and at the end we recommended open courts. So no, let's say, restriction and disciplines, really open courts, because if it is a center of excellence program, then it's on excellence. It's competitive and it's on excellence. And if you want to have, let's say, strategic programs, call them strategic programs and say, okay, this is a program on mental health or on Alzheimer, Parkinson, or cancer or whatever, or this is a program on artificial intelligence. that's up to you. I mean, how you want to do it in your system. But if it's a Center of Excellence program, it's on excellence. And then it should be open. And the universities, they have to do their job. You have to make a pre-selection. And this is where you have, as university, the chance to really combine this bottom-up approach with some kind of strategic issues that you as a university, as a higher education institution, think is important for you in the mid and long term. So I think that's what we discussed essentially.
Yes, and I think our observation was that part of the universities had a very rigorous pre-selection procedure put in place for this particular purpose, and others were not that rigorous, or they didn't have a pre-selection. But then, of course, half of your question was aimed at Vetenskapsrådet, how then the funding agency decides after they have gotten the results from the panel evaluations concerning the different areas of research. So there the responsibility lies with your organization.
Yes, of course, there's a combined responsibility here.
May I?
Yes, of course.
I mean, you always run the risk in these centers. I mean, that because you're a bit sort of risk averse, that what is good in these centers are not new, and what is new in the centers is not good.
Is not yet good.
So in that sense, I mean, you run the risk of sort of avoiding to take risk, given that it's long term and so forth and so on. So, and we see that also actually to some extent in the VINN Excellence. I mean, the programs that have difficulties have a rather complex set of societal stakeholders around them, and they are rather complex also in their epistemic. So I mean, they spend a lot of time actually thinking about who they are, whereas some of those who fail, also that succeed, they think too little about who they are and where they are headed. So you need to encourage bold steps also in establishing, so that you don't bet on safe horses in these programs.
Any more comments on this? Do we have another question here? Here we have the microphone over here. I think it's the fourth row.
Hi.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Hi. My name is Katarina Nordqvist. I'm from Formas. I just want you, if you could elaborate a little bit on the co-funding pros and cons, since, as I understood it, most of the centers in the different kind of funding streams had co-funds.
For the Linnaeus?
Yes.
For the Linnaeus?
Yeah, we can say something as well.
We can, yeah, please, anyone. You can start then.
Shall we start?
Yes,
I mean,
please.
one of the interesting aspects of the VINN Excellence, because you would imagine that co-funding would be the simplest aspect of these centers, but given that they built on such long-term relations with very established societal partners, it was actually a bit difficult to pinpoint what kind of co-funding actually was produced. So in that sense, I mean, you can too much trust between the centers and the network. So I mean, you need to be really clear about the co-funding that is actually afforded, both by universities and by partners, because otherwise you would think that this is merely a kind of something that you do when you construct an application, but you need to be really tough on the inputs, the financial and intellectual inputs of the partners, and that has not been always that easy, even in strategic programs.
Do you want to continue, please?
Well, as mentioned already in the presentation, Jürgen said and pointed out that there was unclarity about what the rules would be, and our impression was that in kind, how did it realize itself, really was there cash or not, etc. But a very important category of co-funding is research infrastructure, important, expensive research infrastructure, and that we saw in many cases to have been the case. And this is, of course, part of building sustainable research environments. But our recommendation, wasn't it, was to have more clarity beforehand of what the financial responsibility of the host institution should be.
We discussed this really in a, I can say, controversial way. There were some members of the committee that said 30% cash. Full stop. That's clear. I mean, if the center gets 600,000 euros a year, then it's 200,000 cash on the table. No way out. Not so obvious for a university. My personal feeling is the university has to show some kind of commitment. This has to be part of the proposal. And if there is more commitment, that's a competitive advantage. But I would not, I personally, but this is my personal opinion. This probably is not the majority meaning of the
It's
committee,
okay.
is co-funding doesn't make a sense. The university has to commit itself, and this has to be clear in the proposal. And the stronger the commitment in terms of infrastructure, technology platforms, blah, 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 the better the position of the university in the competition. But, you know, these co-funding issues are very difficult. Is it 20% of the PI? Is it 10% of the president? Is it, I mean, difficult.
I think there should be much more discussion at the beginning. I think having the discussion about co-funding after a center gets awarded, it's too late. I think the discussion needs to take place before centers are funded. And it should be, in that sense, I think clarity. It's not so much the amount, but there should be clarity about what is the co-funding, what is the infrastructure commitment, because across some subjects, there would be the need for quite a bit of infrastructure as well as actual research time. So I think there needs to be some more discussion really at the process of developing centers.
Thank you.
I have a question.
I think, yes, please. You have time for one other question.
That
Yes.
is about the difficult question, I think.
We cannot hear you.
Then I speak up.
Better.
This is one day. This day costs more than all our projects for 15 years in the programs you are discussing. We have the effect of Lehman Brothers, the economic effect of Lehman Brothers in China, and according to Christine Lagarde, we have this effect. So my question is, how do you formulate scientifically a project that is addressing a scientific problem on the unknown?
That goes to you, John.
I mean, I think in a way, the point you make about a day like this and the cost and everything, in a way, it's fair enough. But I think part of the issue with, I think part of the issue of having centers of excellence, and it's an issue which many research councils and governments and other institutions have played about with in different ways for the last 20, 30, 40 years in different ways, as we have seen in the presentations. But I guess the whole idea of having centers of excellence, it's partly premised on the idea that you're funding groups of researchers whose research will receive recognition as meeting certain standards of excellence, not only because they have got funding, but because what they produce from the funding actually increases the kind of the scholarly, the kind of other impact of their research. So I guess a center of excellence kind of discussion is really premised on the idea that it's like a way to develop excellent research by focusing funding on particular areas, particular themes, particular questions for research. So I think that is why we have had this discussion on and off for really, certainly all of my career, there's been this discussion about how to fund centers of excellence in different ways. And I don't think it's a question that there is one model for centers of excellence, but there's a way in which we're discussing how to focus funding and develop excellent research. And I guess this issue of what is, how we evaluate excellence is part of the issue, of course, because in a way it is academics in various areas of research, disciplines, areas of research, that can come up with some kind of idea of what excellence is in terms of evaluating applications and things like that.
Maybe one quick additional comment. There are always
Yes, of
days
course.
like today.
Yeah.
But I think you have a very good example in your country at the University of Umeå, Emmanuel Charpentier, who was doing pioneering work on CRISPR-Cas. When she did this, would you ever have imagined what would develop out of it? Never.
Yeah.
That's high, the definition of high risk, high gain research, breakthrough research.
Thank you. And we would really like to thank you all evaluators for doing such an excellent work and continuing work. So please give them a big applaud and we will hand out a small gift to them.